So probably the question I hear coaches ask themselves the most, and sometimes they ask me as well, but they ask themselves this question, especially at the low moments of a season, is it worth it? Like, is all the sacrifice of time and effort, not just from ourselves, but from our families, is that worth it? Like coaching costs so much, and from ourselves and from our families. So it makes us question whether it's worth or not. There's a lot of guilt we experience when we spend more time with other people's kids than our own kids. There's that feeling of just being worn down from seasons, the lack of sleep, the lack of self-care, the lack of balance in our life. And there's also this feeling of just, hey, are we really making a difference? Like maybe we're not resonating with our athletes. Maybe we're going through a season where we're doubting ourselves because we're experiencing a lot of losses. And yet I see this question being asked more so for a new reason. Coaches are asking this question, is it worth it? Because they're afraid. They're not afraid of getting fired for losing, though there is that fear. It's not a fear of missing out on family time, though that one still does exist. And it's not a fear that they aren't a good coach, and that one still exists. The fastest growing fear, the one what we're going to talk about today, is this one where coaches lose their job or have to go through some embarrassing investigation over athlete or parent complaints, or even false accusations of misconduct. Coaches in today's environment, I would say especially in the States, feel like they're walking on eggshells, like they're walking this tightrope. And so they're living with this fear of this embarrassing investigation into their coaching or being suspended. And there's also likely a sadness as well, I would imagine, or I know, of like not feeling like you can be true to yourself, true to your values, be the coach that you want to be demanding of your athletes, challenging them. And that's what we're going to get into in today's episode, is how as coaches can we operate, live in this current coaching environment in a way where we can still be true to ourselves, be effective with our team, and navigate some of those tricky situations when it comes to athletes and parent complaints and accusations. Welcome back, or welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerbun. Our mission here is quite simple. We want to help coaches become better leaders and build better team cultures. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Betsy Butterick. Nate Sanderson is taking a bit of a sabbatical at the moment from the podcast, but he'll be back, don't worry. If you're interested in learning more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or if you want to explore our online courses and books, head on over to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter at tocculture.com. It not only includes the notes to each episode of the podcast, but shares articles and other podcasts giving you practical tools, ideas, and strategies to build team culture.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, where we are covering a topic that comes up frequently, more frequently, I think, than JP and I would like, for many of the coaching clients that we work with. And the topic that I'm alluding to is what we will refer to as CYA coaching. And JP, I know you and I have had many conversations about how coaches are finding with increased frequency fear in a space where they're being hired to be leaders and project confidence and operate in a way that adds value to growth and development. And yet what you and I are both hearing from many coaches in, I'll say, across sport is, Betsy, I feel scared to coach. Like I'm just worried about when something I say is going to be used against me, or, when the next thing is going to pop up about how I'm not doing what's expected when I didn't know what the expectations are. And so we are going to take some time today to unpack a little bit about how we got here, what this is about, and specifically what coaches can do in order to shift the focus from CYA to, hey, let's get back to what coaching is really about, providing a transformative experience, supporting the growth and development of young people.
Yeah, I think it's really important as we're kind of getting in here that, me and, you and I are really invested in, like you said, that transformative experience. We want to help coaches create great team cultures that support the development, the mental health, the well-being of athletes. And how we got here, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I love your perspective on it. I just know that I really do encourage and support accountability in the profession of coaching. Like, there are things when I look back on my coaching career where I wish that administrators had challenged my behavior more often, right?
Mm,
Around maybe the language that I was using or my sideline behavior. I wish that sometimes I had been held more accountable for the way that I was interacting with referees and how I was representing the school or the club or the program, right? Like, and all of that. I also wish that I had been a little bit more support, right? Supporting my development, helping me to find out better ways to do things. So, we're this episode is really about how coaches can operate in this space. But before we kind of get into it, I just want to say, hey, like, I really do believe in accountability for coaches, but we are in a tough place now that coaches are just living in fear. I guess my question for you is, how do you think we ended up here?
yeah, and I agree with you, JP, and I'm thinking as you're talking about when I was coaching, and then before that, when I was an athlete, and gosh, it would have been great if some of these were in place for some of the coaches that I played for, and um, not to throw any individual under the bus, but thinking about that quote that we have to remember the root word of discipline is disciple, and we're meant
Mhm.
to teach, not to punish. And I think when I look broadly at the state of sport, at least specifically here in the United States, and I think about when I was a student athlete and how by and large mental health, student athlete well-being was not something that was talked about. And then when I started coaching, now I'm starting to hear and see from professional athletes, from collegiate athletes, just in the psychology space, in the mental performance space, this concept of mental health and what it means to focus on an individual's mental health. And then we're seeing it outside of sports, the way therapy is being destigmatized, the way the definition of well-being is shifting and changing. So I think that by and large, there's been a really positive shift over the last, let's say, 20 years or so to not just focusing on, but prioritizing well being, specifically in the context of sport for the student athlete. Where I feel we've missed an opportunity and where the pendulum needs to swing back a little more is also providing resources, support for the growth and development, the well being of coaches as well. And I think in prioritizing student athlete well-being, there's been a variety of resources that were put in place to help monitor what's going on. How good of a job are we doing? Things like anonymous surveys at the end of seasons, things like anonymous reporting throughout the season. So if anybody has any issue at any time with their coach, with their program experience, that they can make it known. Again, fantastic in intention and without providing context, for example, without sports supervisors or athletic directors or whoever's in charge having a known relationship with the coach, with the program, meaning that they have context, that they have awareness, they know the kids, they know the coach, they understand them as people. We're missing so many pieces that would allow us to better navigate whatever issue or situation pops up. And so I think that there's a variety of things that have contributed. The intention is positive. We want young people to have a great experience. We want to make sure that as coaches, we are acting in a way that supports their well being. And
Mm.
I feel like when we talk about the CYA piece, when we look at social media and the way that the court of public opinion is now able to contribute without context, oftentimes without experience, or after a very long game of social media telephone, there's pressure being put on institutions, on administrations, on coaches by people that aren't actively in the space or have all of the information, let's say. And that becomes a really dangerous place because while people may feel that they're giving information that is supporting a positive experience for student athletes, without all of the context, without all of the info, without the knowledge of who the people and the players are, it's limited. But the cost
Mm.
is really high for coaches. And we see this play out in a variety of ways.
Yeah, it probably was years ago. You didn't win. Like, people might be, they might there might be pressure to take you out of your job. And I think that exists and will always exist in sports. And at the end of the day, we could talk a little bit about that, but I mean, that's just part of coaching and just how you manage that and navigate that. But I think the frustrating thing that you're really, talking about here is that in the guise of caring about athlete well-being and mental health, any complaint that a player or a parent has when their kid's not getting the playing time they want,
Mm,
it's like, oh, you're hurting their mental health. Sometimes we're getting that. It's when a coach holds an athlete accountable,
right.
disciplines them, or it's just
Yeah.
demanding and pushing them. Like, I mean, like, we're so worried about, our athletes going too hard that we're just this protectionism up there that, coaches are afraid to have early morning practices or take their kids out and have them running in the rain, things like that, that are just totally natural and good things and challenging and demanding and what sports is about. Now coaches are afraid to be demanding. They're afraid to challenge. And all of these things, when a coach is doing these things, especially in the right way, they're really trying to say, I believe in the athlete. I believe you're capable. I believe you can go hard. I believe that you can have a good attitude or you can work harder. Like, but yet they're so pulled out of context here, like you said. And what you see is the administration saying, oh, this is about athletes' mental health and well-being. And yet what we really see is that it's more about them protecting themselves as an organization. It's about saving their job, right? So that they're not, on the chopping block. And so that's the really frustrating thing because I don't see enough proactive upstream stuff by a lot of institutions. It's just more like we're going to make sure that we're not, responsible or to blame for an athlete issue. And all of this, and you alluded to it as well too, Betsy, is where is the coach's well-being? Where is the coach's, where's the care for the coach's mental health? The way that these investigations are done, everyone that listens to this podcast, I probably know someone or is someone that has had to go through one of these things. They go
Yeah.
through these investigations. They are left in the dark. They can't talk about it to the, like there's this vow of silence in this through the legal process. And then they just hope. They just hope that they have their job at the end of the day. And it's just, it's super, super, at best, it's super awkward. At worst, and I've seen it, it's traumatizing for the coach and for their family.
Hmm. Yeah, and so much to unpack here, JP. And I want to start with what you just mentioned about the investigation and how it's related to proactive versus reactive. And I think that this is where we have a huge opportunity as coaches, as people in athletics, especially when we're talking about the administrative side. And I want to be really clear. My goal isn't to criticize the way administrators or administrations are currently doing things. My goal is to invite us to look more holistically at the totality of the sport experience. I think we've made great strides in student athlete support and well-being. As you just mentioned, JP, I think that there's a lot of work we can do to be proactive and intentional about providing similar resources for coaches and for administrators. It's also really tough to be in administration. So when we think about investigations, and the worst case that I've ever been made aware of was I had a coach at one time, this was a few years back, tell me, Betsy, my administration let me know that they're going to be doing an investigation, even though they're certain that there's nothing that they're going to find. They said, unfortunately, this is what we feel is the best way to appease the parents that are bringing forth the complaints on behalf of their student athletes. And that I remember feeling so distraught at hearing that what this individual was about to be put through, what their family was about to be put through, all the things you just mentioned of hoping and being, isolated, and yet still being asked to show up and coach your team and to act as if nothing has changed or is going on, but things are going on, but you don't know what's going
Mhm.
on and you don't know when it's going to end. And just to watch coaches over the years go through those things, even when nothing is found, nothing of merit is found. And then they're like, oh, you're good. Like, don't worry. Yeah, we thought there might be something there, but we checked it out. We did our due diligence. There's nothing there. So you're good. You may resume coaching the way that you were. Coaches are forever changed. Programs are forever changed. Trust is broken. There's suspicion. There's so many things that are residual after we do the due diligence of the investigation that that we're not addressing, not in a way that allows for well-being on the part of the coaches or the athletes. And so while the process of investigating complaints is necessary and important, I think we have a big opportunity to be intentional about what that process looks like, in addition to the legal specifications that have to happen to maintain the integrity of the investigation. I also think that there needs to be support, ongoing support during and after, for the people that are involved, because they can't talk to each other. And I can't tell you the number of coaches that have said, Betsy, I just wish at some point during all of this, my AD or my sport administrator would say, hey, I know we can't talk about it, but how are you doing? Like just
Mhm.
checking in, that feeling of isolation, because you're managing it at work and then you're also managing at home. And there's people in the community that, oh, an investigation's being done and they're looking at you sideways. And it's like, and you don't know what they're looking for. And that's often the hardest thing when I hear coaches share, this allegation has been brought against me. And I don't know where that's coming. I can't think of a time when that was true. And I don't know what else is coming up. And there's as a person, that level of doubt, that insecurity, you say things you hear like, coach is negatively impacting my mental health, or coach is just crushing my confidence. Like, and I'm not in a good place. I don't feel confident anymore. It's like, yeah, I get it. Like, what does this do to a coach's confidence? What does this
Mhm.
do to a coach's mental health and well-being? And it's not that one is more important than the other. It's that I think we need to be really intentional with how we go about doing the work to optimize the experience, so that we're not just covering our assets, let's say, but we are being intentional about, okay, how do we take what's not working and make it better, but not just at the expense of, protecting anonymity. How do we make it better so that everyone feels good about the work that we're doing? And the
Mhm.
feeling good piece I want to double down on for a second, because a phrase I often hear athletes say specifically is, I'm not comfortable having that conversation. And I think in sports, specifically with young people today, this is one of the things that we really need to pay attention to. How are we prioritizing comfort? What is the relationship between comfort and discomfort and mental health and well-being? Because if we look at, let's say, Gen Z and the way technology has provided greater ease to the point that sometimes hard is viewed as negative, put that in a sports context. We know, like if you've ever lifted weights, you only build muscle by breaking small fibers and allowing them to regrow and become stronger. If we're not able to push, if we don't reach the edge of comfort, we're not going to experience growth. And if growth isn't possible, if growth isn't desired, then what are we doing? How are we
Mhm.
going to get better? Now, how you push, yes, that matters. But discomfort, if that's a red flag, I think we're going to continue to see big challenges in the coaching profession. How do we define what is and isn't targeting versus holding someone accountable? How do we
Mhm.
define what is detrimental to mental health versus necessary for growth and long-term health and well-being? I think these are really important conversations to have.
Yeah, and you talk about that athlete experience, and that's so much becomes the accusation is that parents are lobbying against is they've ruined their experience, they've ruined their senior season, they've ruined this coach has ruined, and all that athlete has really experienced is just discomfort and challenge and stress over maybe not playing as much as they wanted or being challenged to being in a demanding environment. And there's so much philosophical things that, like, just looking at the core, like, I think there's deeper questions that organizations and institutions need to ask. And like you said, this isn't all about just athletic directors failing or club directors failing. I mean, I literally have coached a coach or an athletic director in the last year who just was non-renewed, and it was over this type of issue. And the people around him, the coaches, are devastated that he's not been non-renewed because he was supporting a coach, and because he supported a coach, he was non-renewed at the end of the day, right? Because he was backing his
Yeah.
coaches, a coach that was trying to do the right thing and trying to provide a good athlete experience. So it's a frustrating thing. And yet today we really want to kind of like to maybe take the next part of our conversation into is okay, what do we do as coaches in this environment, right? So hopefully, if you're
Yeah.
an administrator and you've been listening to this, great. Maybe these are some great reflection questions. But like, let's talk about what do we do as coaches, right? I mean, outside of just get out of coaching, which some people obviously feel like might be
Yeah.
the solution. Where do you start in this process, as a coach, so that you're not living in fear in your job? You're not just constantly worried about how to, cover yourself here.
Yeah. And that's such an important question to ask. And I think about the number of times, JP, that I've had a conversation with a coaching client and said the exact words, look, if at the end of the day you tell me, Betsy, I don't know that it's worth it. Like I think it's time for me to get out of coaching. I would understand and I would
Mhm.
support that decision. And
100%.
if you want to stay in coaching, let's talk about what you can do, what you can be proactive. Because I think that proactive piece is really helpful. Is it going to prevent everything from, ever being wrong in your experience professionally? No. But the more proactive, the more intentional we can be, the better we set ourselves and the athletes in our program up for success. And for me, that often starts at the interview process. So when you are being interviewed, and so often we think about, I want to present myself as the best candidate for this position. I want to convince them that I'm the right person. I also encourage coaches, do your due diligence and make sure that this is the right job or fit or people specifically for you, especially because by and large we are in this CYA space of sport, making sure that you have what you need, not just to be successful in your sport, but to be supported, particularly in moments of challenge. And for me, and I wrote out a list so I wouldn't have to remember it all, but some questions that coaches can ask during the hiring process, like ask the tough questions. What's the current process for handling student athlete complaints? How involved is the sport administrator or sport supervisor? For example, do they know the coaches of the sports that they oversee very well? Are they more often on the periphery or out of sight? Do they have knowledge and awareness and relationship or contact with the student athletes in a particular program? What are the expectations for me as a coach, and what's the associated timeline? Like you said, JP, it used to be, well, we expect you to start producing, over 500 or winning seasons within the first 2, 3 years. It's about so much more. And I'm grateful that it is than just winning for many coaches now, and understanding what those expectations are outside of our assigned job responsibilities is really important. Asking, in the past, however many years, I wrote three, has a head coach been fired or voluntarily reassigned or resigned due to student athlete or parent complaints? And again, knowing the legality of the situations, asking someone as much information as you're able to share. Can you give me a sense of what happened there, so that I have an awareness of, what to be conscious of and intentional about as I consider, becoming part of this community. Um, what type of student athlete surveys are currently used? How and when are they administered? By whom? And who are the results shared with and when? Again, I've had an experience where I invited an administrator to share the questions that were on the end of season surveys, the exit interview questions, with the coaching staff. And the response that I got is, we would never do that. And I asked why. And they said, well, because we want it to be a true litmus test. We need to know without bias if they're hitting these marks. And I said, gosh, I think it would be really helpful both for the coaches and the student athletes if they knew the questions, so that they could be intentional about providing what you feel are the most important elements for a quality experience. I know you want to have an unbiased litmus test. And if we know the expectations on the front end and we're able to meet or exceed them, does that add value for the group as a whole? Under what circumstances is it permissible for me to remove a student athlete from our roster? Some coaches don't have that ability, and they will tell me, Betsy, this kid is killing my culture, or this is, an individual that is not a good teammate or beneficial for the program. However, my hands are tied. I'm not allowed to remove them from my roster, so I just need to make it work. Um, and then what's the process for taking that kind of action if it is permissible? And why do coaches tend to leave a certain school? So this is not an exhaustive list, but thinking about, before you accept a coaching position, identifying what's true currently, and then also being intentional about if there's certain levels of support that you know you would need in order to Be okay. I'm not talking about wins and losses, but just be okay as a person in this context. Ask those questions, find out as much as you can so that you can make an informed decision about where you choose to coach so that you can set yourself and your student athletes up for long-term success.
It's not an exhaustive list, Betsy, but it's a really, really good list, and we'll put it in the notes to the
Okay.
podcast for people. So anybody listening, you can definitely make sure you're getting the weekly newsletter so you can get those notes, because that's a phenomenal list. And those types of questions are really, really valuable to be asking, whether you're going to a club, whether you're going at the collegiate level, high school level, wherever you're coaching, to start to ask those questions. The thing is, what you're trying to get clarity around is, how will I be assessed? And I think it's absolutely ridiculous. And that's the case you're giving us there. The one administration that was like, we're not going to tell you what the questions that we're asking. Like any corporate culture today, like, this is how you will be assessed as a leader and a manager. Here are the criteria. Here are the questions that your employee, the people under you are going to be asked, right? Like, they know that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's super clear. So it's crazy, but what you're trying to do as a coach by asking these questions is give an understanding of, okay, how will I be assessed in my role? And is based upon those assessments, is this the right place for me? Now, I bet you if you ask these questions, honestly, a lot of administrations won't have really good answers. I took a job back in 2020, and we're asking, like, okay, let's just go down this path of, let's just say things, we're struggling this year. At what point would you say, you know what, we need to move on, maybe let you go from this coaching job of this real pro team that I was working with in Ireland? The committee had no idea how to answer that question, right? I
Mm.
think sometimes they're just winging it by just like, once they get into these situations, and it's very unintentional. So I think it's great questions. I don't necessarily know we're always make great answers, right? And if we don't get great answers, that's probably a little bit of a yellow flag. We should go, okay, there's not a lot of intentionality or thought to their processes here. And all these things reveal where you look and say, okay, this is the place that I may want to go coach, or I'm interviewing for. And you reflect back on what is most important to you as a coach. What are your core values? Who are you? How do you want to coach? Right? And know what you're not willing to give up and sacrifice is so important. And then what you're willing to be flexible on, right? You could recognize, okay, I'm going to a place that's going to be a high pressure, I have to win environment. That may not be the most important thing to me. I really believe in transformational coaching, making an impact, and I recognize that. But I'm okay. I'd actually love to. I'd be well suited for a high pressure environment where you have to win. Other people might say, you know what? I just want to be in a place that actually prioritizes athlete development and culture and doing things the right way. And if that means that we have to let go of a really talented player so we can maintain a strong culture and a good experience, then I'm about that, right? Like, at the end of the day, though, you got to know what you're not willing to sacrifice, and really honestly what you're willing to be fired over. Like, and if you can know that, then you can maybe make a better decision around whether you want to coach at this institution, this organization, or this club. And then even when you do take that job, you know what you're in for. And that way you're not maybe thrown out of sorts when all of a sudden they do go down that path and they are appeasing parents or other complaints. You go, okay, well, we knew this is what was going to happen, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're spot on, JP. And the negotiables, the non-negotiables, a phrase that comes up for me for coaches to reflect on is what needs to be true. What needs to be true for me to operate in my integrity and coach the way that I want to coach? And then
Mhm.
build your questions that you ask during the interview process around what needs to be true. And like you said, if they don't know the answer, that's also information. Maybe it's not the information you're hoping to get, but it is information. And then it allows you to go back and reassess, is the best place for me? And you mentioned, what are you willing to be fired for? So there's going to be so many different challenges thrown at any coach at any level at any given time. What are the most important battles for you to fight? And how do you want to fight? Who do you want to be as you approach those? I say to clients, is this the hill you want to die on? Is this the most important thing? If this were the thing that ended up getting you fired, would you be okay with that? If you say yes, I am all in. Let's go for it. Let's talk about how you can advocate for yourself. If this isn't the most important thing, then let's talk about what that looks like. So asking yourself the questions that you just mentioned, JP, to get that clarity so that you can be proactive in having conversations that allow you to get information to assess not only how you're going to be evaluated, but also what's the likelihood of you being able to coach in your integrity and authenticity in this environment?
Mm, that's I love the way you frame that. I think that's just really important that we have answered those questions for ourselves and we have clarity on that before we step into it. Now let's talk about when you're in it, right?
Dun,
Like
dun,
you're in
dun.
this yeah, you're in that situation where things are, that there's a certain environment and a certain culture, whether it's the parents in a club or school, whether it's the pressure from boosters, whether it's just, an administration that wants to avoid a lawsuit or at all costs, right? You're in
Ah,
that environment. A
yeah.
lot of our coaches are like, yeah, I'm already living in this environment. I'm already in the job, right? Whatever about taking the job, I'm in the job. So, what are some things from your perspective, Betsy, that you would recommend coaches explore doing in this regard to really navigate that situation?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking, and I know my answer is biased being a communication specialist, but for me, the answer is all conversation based. What are the conversations that you need to have to provide a certain level of certainty or confidence or safety for how you operate in that space? And who needs to be involved in the conversations? Sometimes it's sport administrators or athletic directors or someone on the administration side. Oftentimes, it's our team. Sometimes, and with increasing frequency, it is also the parents of the young people that are part of our program. I also made a list, JP, of questions or topics that I would encourage coaches to consider when they're thinking about what conversations do I need or want to have in order to create a level of safety within my coaching environment. So, negotiables and non negotiables, which you touched on before, clearly identify for yourself first. Like, what needs to be true for me to operate in alignment with my values, my authenticity? Setting and level setting expectations. So, if I'm just working with my team, let's say, letting the team know as your coach, this is what I expect of you as student athletes. And as student athletes, this is what you can expect of me as your coach. That's typically where I see coaches hit the mark. An opportunity that they miss is to ask for those expectations in reverse. So to ask the
Mhm.
people in your program, as student athletes, what do you expect of me as your coach? And as student athletes, what do you expect that I can expect of you? When we have those four pieces, now we have perfect clarity on where are we already in alignment with expectation setting and where do we need to level set expectations or realign so that we create shared understanding. So many of the challenges that I hear coaches share, or so many of the complaints that come from student athletes, for me, often could have been avoided or minimized if there had been conversation. If
Yeah.
we had talked about and created shared understanding, if we talked about expectations, instead of letting things get to a point where now it's problematic for the athlete, for the coach, for the program, but it could have been avoided if we'd had the conversation sooner. So
Let me
whatever
jump real quick in
conversations.
on that too, Betsy.
Yeah.
Just one thought on that because I think this is huge, and I know you got some really other great points too. But I even sometimes encourage, even at the collegiate level, in the recruitment process with parents, high schools, same question of just like, hey, you're sending your child, sometimes thousands of miles away to go to school
Mhm.
and be under my care. What do you need from me? Or what are your expectations of me so that I can help them to be successful here and
Yep.
successful not just as an athlete on the court or the field, but as successful when it comes to their academics. And you may actually hear a lot of great things that you agree with. And then you also might hear like an expectation that you don't agree with. And then that's a great time to have the conversation. Is right then is like, actually, I'm not going to wake your daughter up on to or make sure she gets to class. Like that is not no longer that
Right.
is not my responsibility. And so then you actually get clarity on that before you get into the situation. So I think it goes. That just one encouragement there is just on that point is just bring parents into the mutual expectations conversation.
Yes, and as early as possible. And I mentioned with like coaches and athletes, if we'd had this conversation earlier and you're backing it up, especially at the college level, it's like the earliest you can have the conversation, which for many coaches is during the recruiting process with prospective student athletes, with prospective parents, like having the conversations to get as much information as you possibly can to determine, is this person likely a good fit for me long term? or bare minimum to level set those expectations. Like, no, I won't be making sure your kid is up in time to go to class because they're an adult. And I think that because piece is really important. And getting back to some of the conversations, we are fully in the space where it benefits us as coaches to be very intentional. And I know you have an entire book on this, JP, and I love that you do, on involving our parents. We can be intentional about teaching our parents how to work well with us to support the kind of experience we want to provide for their young person. We can be intentional about sharing our expectations of both the student athlete and of them as parents or caregivers. We can have that conversation. Like you mentioned, we can ask what they're expecting of us. We can talk to them about, these are ways I would love for you to be proactive and involved in our program. This, in certain contexts, like let's say competition, is behavior we would love to see. This is what support looks like, sounds like in our program. This is also what we can't have or won't allow because it's out of alignment with who we've said we want to be as a program and what the experience we're trying to provide, especially when there's conversations we're not going to have. The one about playing time often comes up. I won't be talking with you about your child's playing time because I want to support your child's ability to advocate for themselves. And so if they would like to share what came out of our conversation, they're allowed to, or I'm happy to talk with you after I've had the initial conversation with your young person because I want to teach them how to advocate for what's most important to them. So whatever you're unwilling to do, especially making sure that you clarify for parents or support people why that's true for you, the purpose or value that it adds to the student and the student athlete experience. Transparency, big one. With parents, yes, but also with your team. Like, how well do the athletes in your program know you and understand what you're about? As a coach, yes, philosophy wise, but as a person, like, can they reliably predict how you would likely respond in a variety of situations? If they can, what that tells me as an outside observer is there's a lot of transparency here. Your student athletes know who you are. And if they know who you are, there's less likelihood that certain actions are going to be misinterpreted or you're going to be misjudged because you've created that level of understanding. Being able to co-create clear, accessible avenues for feedback. And this is something that often we don't talk about. We say we have an open door policy. If something's an issue for you, come talk to us. Fantastic. As a starting point, how are we intentional as coaches, as administrators, about proactively teaching young people the skills to actually have that conversation? And how are we allowing them to practice those skills before they're needed, before something's actually on the line that matters to them? Best of intentions, come talk to us. Where we miss the mark is if we're not actively providing education, just like we would in our sport. If we're not teaching them skills, or if we're not providing opportunities for them to get reps, then we're not doing very much to help them build the confidence and ability to walk through our door and have the conversations that matter most. And again, I know I'm biased, but as a communication specialist, I think if that's the one thing that we committed to as coaches, as administrators, as student athletes, if we can commit to adding conversational skills to what we train as a team, to how we practice as people, especially long after our playing days are over, I think that is going to set us up for future success in a way that very little else can.
Yeah, just let me jump in. I'm just curious, Betsy, what's a way that in
Yeah.
that situation that you've seen coaches or administrators really support that skill development in athletes? Most coaches here aren't going to have the benefit of, Betsy coming in to do communications, work with their players. So what's a simple way that people could do that?
Yeah, and you don't need me. I mean, you don't need to, this doesn't have to cost anything monetarily. It will take a certain amount of time, but if you're willing to, and if you understand the value of allocating that time in your training to working on certain skills like this is something anybody can do. One of the ways that I've seen it done organically is, and I'll do this with teams sometimes, coach, you can play the role of facilitator, do the exact same thing, is you can ask the people on your team, what's an issue that's come up within teams that you've been on the past? So if you want to create a little separation, and we're not going to, talk about the thing that has yet to be aired out in this team, but what's, certain situations that have come up in teams that you've been on in the past. And then you're sourcing from your athletes based off of their lived experience, different scenarios. These scenarios now become the foundation for the practice that you can do together. So I might source scenarios, and then I'm going to break my team up into small groups, and I'm going to give everybody the same scenario and say, okay, here's the scenario. In your groups, everyone needs to have a role. And I want you to come up with a 2-minute skit about how you would have the conversation to address the issue in this scenario. And then they start to role play. They start to practice. And then as a group goes, let's say they give their 2-minute skit, and I'll preface this beforehand. I'll say, I want you to come up with a 2-minute skit roughly about how you'd have this conversation. And I want you to make it real. If it's likely that, you tried to hold this person accountable, or you broached the subject with that person and they didn't respond positively, or they became very defensive or reactive, great, show us that. Because we want to prepare for what this really looks like, not just the ideal version of how this would go. So finding opportunities for people to get reps, even if we just have one group go and everybody else that's watching, once that group finishes, as a facilitator, what I'll ask the group is, okay, can I get 2 things that the people who are watching saw that you thought added value to this conversation? Like 2 things that they did well, or 2 things that you felt were helpful or added value, any version of that question. And so from their peers, they're getting that acknowledgement of, yeah, this was really good, or I loved when you said this, or you did this. And then I'll say, if this was a real scenario, I'd like to hear from the audience 2 things that might help this go better if it were real, or 2 things that might be useful if someone was asked to do this, and a lot was on the line. So it's not being critical of, this is, things that you didn't do well. We're learning together. If there was any value to add, what might they shift or change to do it differently in perhaps an elevated way moving forward? So giving opportunities for them to get reps before they actually need to do hard things like address a peer and hold them accountable while worrying that the relationship is on the line. To do real things like have a conversation with a coach about something the coach said to them that didn't land well and why, so that we can create a better path forward together. Because if we let discomfort stop us from having the conversations, very little is likely to change. And it's likely things will get worse before they get better. Yeah. So, when it comes to communication, when it comes to being proactive as a coach with your team specifically, and with whoever else you feel would be beneficial to do, just like you would coach your sport, provide skills or tools, and then give them the ability to practice. Let's get some quality reps before we go compete in situations that matter. And the last few things I'll add, JP, for me, clarify choices, decisions, consequences, or choices, decisions, outcomes. So continually having the conversation with our team of, when you make certain choices, and we all have choices that we need to make, based upon the decision of many choices, you pick one, based upon the decision that you make, there are certain things that will or won't happen. We can call them consequences or outcomes. And then continually and consistently speaking in the language of choice, so that people are very aware that things aren't just happening to them. And this is often a challenge that I hear. Student athletes will tell me about certain things that they seem to be at the mercy of because the coach is in charge. And so all of this is happening to them. And one of the conversations we can have as support people, whether we're administrators or coaches, is to start to help young people identify, or parents identify, okay, in this situation, what choices do you have? What are the things that they can be proactive about? A question I often ask after a student athlete tells me about a situation that's challenging for them with a coach, I'll ask for an example. And in asking for the example, that also gives me some sense of recency. Did this happen 2 years ago, or did this happen 2 days ago? But then I'll also ask, okay, tell me up until this point, what have you done to try to improve the quality of the situation or change the circumstance as it currently exists? This is where I get really good information, because sometimes they'll say, what do you mean? Or, well, I haven't done anything, or I told my parents, or, I told the sports supervisor. And this is where we can start to get into choices. It's like, okay, it's unlikely that your coach is going to be able to change something about this circumstance if they don't yet know that this is an issue for you. So let's talk about what needs to be true, or what it will take for you to be able to have that conversation. So just really starting to get a little more specific about what choices people have, whether those people are student athletes, parents, administrators, even coaches. And then how can we be very intentional about responding to situations in a thoughtful way instead of a more reactive way? And then when we experience a challenge, what needs to be true to minimize this challenge being repeated in a different circumstance in the future? Or how can we better weather or navigate this challenge should it arise again? These are all conversation scenarios that we can start to think through. And the more time we spend being proactive, the less time we need to spend being reactive, or the less detrimental those reactions might be for us as coaches and for the young people that we support in our program.
Yeah, and I think the various strategies you've covered there help us to kind of get in front or when those situations start to come up. And I think those are tools that coaches can use, that administrators can use. I think the great challenge in all this is I think probably some coaches are going, we're operating from this place of, well, should I have to do all this? Right. Like I'm already
Yeah,
doing so much as a coach for my
yeah,
athletes. I just want to go out and coach and care about kids. And, why should I have to do all these types of things? And I definitely get that, and I definitely get the whole idea of stepping away from, I'm just done. Like and that I
yeah,
think that's where some coaches are, at is they are stepping away because it's wearing on them and it's beating them down. And yet I think the very fact that we have to, if we want to be in coaching, engage with these challenges is the very reason we need you in coaching, because now more than ever we need people that are going to help our athletes, help the parents of athletes to really take different perspectives, to stop seeing themselves always as the victim, and to start to see hard things and discomfort. All these things you've talked about as good things. Like this challenge is the very opportunity that coaching is presenting us at this moment to really help people.
yeah. And same JP, I hear it all the time. Oh, Betsy, I shouldn't have to do this. Or my administration should be the one doing this. Or why do I have to do this? And I usually start with, yeah, like I feel you. It's frustrating to feel like this is where we've gotten to at coaching. And despite how we feel about whether we should or shouldn't have to do this is where we are. Going back to choice. So, given that this is where we are, what choice do you want to make? Are you willing to do things even though you believe you shouldn't have to? Are you wanting to do things because you understand the value they might provide and the ways that they might prevent you from having to experience other things if you don't have these conversations because you shouldn't have to? But if you're
Mhm.
listening right now and you feel like, "Ugh, I hate that we're here, like we shouldn't have to do this. This isn't what we signed up for." Yeah, I feel you. And I mean that genuinely. It is a challenging time to be a coach. And I say this often, what used to be a conversation is now often an investigation. And it saddens me to have that be our reality. And yet it does not change our reality. So what choices do we have? What can we do to get back to what we truly signed up for? To be able to create an environment where instead of operating out of fear, we are operating out of joy.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it all comes back to the very beginning of just knowing who we are as a coach, knowing what's important for us, and then just continuing to find a place where we can still operate, within that space. And um, I think in many situations, obviously, I get that losing your job is can be traumatic, can be very difficult. But I've also seen coaches do that. They've handled that situations. They've stayed true to themselves, and they have a lot of pride. And also, it's been a huge impact on the people around them to see how they did stay true to themselves in those spaces. And I'm sure there's people that have listened to this podcast that are. I'd also just kind of leave us with this encouragement, because I also sense this kind of as in the culture, and also I've even had people reach out to me that are listeners to the podcast around this thing, which is we really need to make sure that we're also not part of the problem on here. I remember like a year ago we had a very well-known college coach who's won a lot of national championships come on this podcast, and this coach had a long career and a really, there's so much stuff that the impact they've had, but there were some accusations along their journey as a coach, and they were not founded, and everything that I've looked up and known this coach, and yet people are like, oh, you shouldn't have had that coach on there. They had accusations, and it's like, is that really how we want to operate here? That we just because someone's saying that we're not going to, kind of stand by coaches, and really just be patient. And I definitely get that there's investigations and there's coaches that have done things that need to be held accountable. I think the big thing here is that we just need to not be quick to fall into that thing of gossiping, within coaching. And I think at the end of the day, too, every one of us coaches most likely within a club or a school, athletic department, whatever it be. And we know there are coaches around us. And I think it's about also us not just not speaking poorly about other coaches or buying into that gossip. It's about actually having another coach's back when they're going through something. And I think there's so many often times where I've been so fortunate, so grateful that I've been able to walk with coaches through this really, really hard time. And I can just tell you that one of the things that actually is sad for me is that other coaches in the building know that this is going on, and yet they're awkward and they don't reach out to that person, that human being. And so I would just encourage everybody here, whether it's you going through this or somebody else in that building or in your club that is going through one of these tough times where there have been maybe the brunt of some sort of false accusations or investigations, right? Is just to go and be with that person, to support that person, and just check in with that human being, because that's the culture that we need to create to keep good coaches in there, is one where coaches actually feel supported. All right, that's it for today's episode of the podcast. Wow, there are a lot of notes on that episode. I bet Betsy was, rolling out loads of different strategies, tools, tips. So don't miss out on those notes. Be sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Also, I would highly recommend you check out my book, The Sports Parent Solution. This book is my guide for coaches on working with sports parents. Also, my online course, Working with Sports Parents, it's not just going to teach you how to engage parents and work with them. It's going to give you the resources so you can run effective parent meetings, activities, and handle conflict as it arises. If you want that course, you can get $25 off the course if you subscribe to the TOC newsletter. So there'll be a coupon in that newsletter. Thank you again for listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast. Please support us by not just subscribing, but by sharing.